a statement that can be taken as indication that from the very start, in Kant's mind, these orders are much more closely related than contemporary readers tend to assume. It's true, of course, that after his early 1760s turn to Rousseau and his dramatic realization that the distinctive fulfillment of the human species concerns our practical rather than exclusively theoretical capacities, Kant frequently contrasts the determined theoretical order of nature with the pure practical order of absolute freedom. Nonetheless, I think Des gets in this, after this turn, and even earlier, Kant also insists that reason is unified, and theoretical philosophy must find a way, eventually transcendental idealism, to allow metaphysical room for our practical reason to be an absolute source of effects and connect to the world, despite all that his system entails about nature as a lawfully determined spatial temporal order. The key move here, I think, is in Kant's practical philosophy, where he goes with the Rousseauian abandonment of the notion that freedom must come with lawlessness. Earlier, he'd connected freedom with lawlessness, and he changed. And his development then of a conception of what he calls, and this is the crucial trick, our nature as free beings. So he brings freedom into nature and connects the two. So we have in our freedom a nature that, like all natures, is governed by a law, in this case, the moral law. And as has been noted above, therefore, this is an order that Kant sometimes prefers to call supersensible rather than supernatural, despite its definitely non-empirical character. Why? Well, this is because there's a sense in which the term nature becomes very appropriate here, even if it's not meant in a physical sense. This is because for Kant, the term nature, in its most general sense, there are various quotes for this, signifies the law-governed structure of a concrete item of whatever kind. So freedom can be kind of natural in a sense. In this broad sense for Kant, then, nature is not entirely opposed to grace, for there is a moral nature that defines the distinct system of prescriptive laws governing concrete rational beings in general, and that's formally similar to the descriptive law-governed structure of physical beings as such, even though this moral nature, and it alone, at its deepest level, is also determined by essentially teleological rather than mechanical laws or principles. And Kant's notion of our lawful moral nature also underlies his cosmopolitan historical idea of the special practical telos of the human species. According to this idea of reason, which is closely connected to the metaphysical postulates of pure reason, we are to believe that there's an underlying theodicycal pattern within human history such that all legal and political developments will eventually lead to conditions that make possible the fulfillment of our sublime moral vocation. And this pattern of human history proceeds at first through a kind of cunning of reason that does not at first require any moral intentions on our part, let alone any miraculous interventions from above, and is entirely consistent with all the laws governing the physical natural world and even psychologically egoistic developments of human history. Scholars such as Paul Guyer and Eric Watkins have begun to trace the complexity of Kant's account here of how his overarching critical conception of purposive moral order coheres with his full theoretical account of nature and his entire system of philosophy. And work like this helps us to see that there is, after all, an underlying unity to Kant's work, and especially the third critique, which can seem like just arbitrarily put together, but there is an interconnected account there of aesthetics and physical nature, and how these are supposed to be completed by, and not merely juxtaposed with, references to a supersensible, that is, moral ground for all existence that alone gives human life a generally meaningful purpose. All I'm going to be adding here, some next pages, is just a few more details which give us some evidence that Kant's unified view of freedom of nature and of the human and divine order is not a late addition to his thought, but it's just kind of a blick that he had from the very beginning. And that's what metaphysics does, finds reasons for our original views. So the unity behind Kant's vision, and this is my hermeneutical hypothesis, maybe it goes back to his very first, earliest philosophical experiences, when, according to Jachmann's account, one of his first biographers, of Kant's own frequent recollections in later life, you know how an older person goes back to their first experiences very clearly and repeatedly. His pietist mother apparently took her young children out to the edge of town at night so that they could see all the more clearly from a point, in fact, not very far from Copernicus's home, quote, the power, wisdom, and goodness of the creator of all things in the stars of the northern European sky. Jachmann's account seems to me genuine and especially relevant since it links a reference to the mother's awakening of an appreciation of, quote, the impressions of nature, with a mention also of the seed, the keim of goodness, a phrase that we now know plays the key role throughout Kant's work on religion and our moral nature. And a similar linking of the natural and the moral orders can be found in the long quote from the Moral Mongovius 4:1 there about, first sentence is the key thing, the order in nature excites wonder and respect in us at all times. So the Bewunderung, sometimes it's for nature, sometimes it's the moral law, it's all kind of mixed together for Kant ever since he was 5. But how do you justify it changes over time. So it was only when Kant was almost 40 years old, and after many years of studying the impressions of nature in a scientific way, he came back through the close study of Rousseau's moral writings in the 1760s to concentrate then finally again on the seed and destiny of our nature in a primarily moral sense with a specific law of its own. Even before that time, however, in the first 2 decades of Kant's career, it's significant that he regularly added remarks about design, development, and divinity in his natural philosophy. His early essays on metaphysics and even on natural history are composed on the presumption that there's an evident, overarching teleological unity to the universe, one that redounds all the more appropriately to the Creator's wisdom and goodness because it does not appeal, as he thinks Newtonianism or occasionalism might, to repeated miracle-like interventions or acts of support by the deity. For example, in the Beweisgrund of 1763, Kant makes a twofold theoretical teleological claim. This is quotes 1 and 2 over, I think on the next sheet there. Basically that they're both necessary and contingent orders of nature that God is behind, or basically God's perfection is behind at the time. That's the way he's thinking it. So in his critical work, Kant gives up taking this teleological claim to be a demonstrable theoretical proposition, that is, say, from the notion of God's perfection. And so later he just provides a new moral ground for it. But it's striking that even in his earlier phase, he's concerned above all with the same thing, namely a tight overarching order of God, humanity, and nature all at once, with no need for interruption anywhere, or no absolute need for interruption anywhere by miraculous events. Although at this point, it does look probably come to this, Kant does speak sometimes of a system, quote, that could do without the assistance of frequent miracles. I think what's more significant here is that nonetheless he goes so far as to challenge Newton, it's on page 110, who he thinks did rely on miraculous intervention to prevent the universe from falling back to what would seem to be a state of complete stagnation. And in a footnote, I think typical of Kant's firm theodistical attitude and boldness from his youth on, he argues that whatever our local problems, according to Newton's latest work, we can still use, we in Königsberg can use our cosmological imagination to postulate that the universe can still have, quote, great fruitfulness elsewhere. So in this way, we can still maintain a fully teleological and yet seamlessly natural conception of the mundane sphere as a whole, governed in a non-interventionist manner by an all-encompassing, purposeful design. This section of the Beweisgrund also bears a close relation to Kant's 1784 idea for universal history. Both discussions, separated by many, many years, to focus on the seeming indeterminacy that arises from actions that, quote, issue from freedom and harbor within themselves a possibility of deviating from what is the good. And both discussions call attention to statistical laws that apply even to human actions that appear significantly free, such as marriage choices. In the Beweisgrund, to be sure, Kant still speaks sometimes without direct reservations about, quote, immediate divine intervention and revelation at specific times and among specific nations. He speaks about that. It's very significant, therefore, that in his otherwise parallel discussions later, Kant does not speak in this way, and he instead stresses that endorsing rare miracles is just as questionable as referring specifically to frequent ones. But although this is an important change in language, it can be taken, I think, as a natural development of some strands already in Kant's thought in the 1760s. For even the Beweisgrund ends its discussion by saying, quote, I think this is 3, I should find it amazing if anything occurred or could occur in the course of nature in need of a miracle to improve it, and were such an event to occur, it would be utterly incomprehensible to us. In addition, Kant already uses roughly the same example here as in the dramatic culmination of the quoted discussion at the end of the second part of the Religion, namely the amazing phenomenon of the regeneration and the fruitfulness of plants and animals, to argue against the other leading scientific figure of the time, Buffon, that there's no need to refer to immediate divine action, quote, for one must concede to the things of nature a possibility greater than that which is commonly conceded of producing their effects in accordance with universal laws, end of quote. And so given this attitude, it's not surprising that even prior to the critical turn as such, Kant's 1770 dissertation ends with a section that proposes as a first rule of judging that, quote, all things in the universe take place in accordance with the order of nature, and hence comparative miracles, such as the influence of spirits, are carefully excluded from the explanation of phenomena. In his metaphysics lectures, Kant explains that a comparative miracle would be an event that seems supernatural in relation to our reason, but can still occur according to certain laws unknown to us. And so to speak of miracles in this extended sense is still not to concede that there are miracles strictly speaking. But the most revealing point that Kant makes here is when he adds a clause, this is a quote, yeah, I think it's number 4, that a miracle is not something of which we do not cognize the cause, but rather that of which we do not cognize the laws. Thus, magnetic power is no miracle, for we cognize its law, but not the cause, presumably the ultimate cause. I take this to be an extremely significant qualification because it suggests that the distinction between law, or at least involving law, and cause, or finding the ultimate cause, may be the main reason that Kant believed he could regard our own absolute freedom and all its theodicycal involvement with the moral assistance of God and nature as not miraculous in the bad sense. For even if we cannot literally know the ultimate causings at work here either, we still do grasp the law behind their operation, which in this case is moral. And so in that sense, we're not going beyond nature in its most fundamental meaning, which is simply to be lawful. There's a second point that's crucial here. Kant conceives of our free action as not only lawful, but also internally governed in a number of important but distinct senses. Two here. Insofar as our action is normatively guided by the moral law, and insofar as has already been noted, Kant regards this law as internal to the structure of our practical reason, there is a sense in which a moral agent is following something within its own self. That is, not its merely individual and psychological self, but rather its general nature as a being of practical reason. This internality condition is significant here because it implies for Kant that ultimately our action is normatively not to be thought of as guided by an external, that is, heteronymous ad hoc force, such as either mere feelings or physical or historical forces, or even God thought as arbitrarily interrupting us by using miraculous power. Secondly, in a metaphysical causal sense, it's also true that insofar as we take ourselves to be an ultimate subject, as Kant does, then each of our actions has an internal efficient cause, but now in the very different sense of resting precisely in our concrete individuality as such. Here too, this source, even if not omnipotent, is to be thought of as independent in its original direction of any external, that is, metaphysical ad hoc force, such as either, again, mere feelings or physical or historical forces, or even God thought of as arbitrarily interrupting us by using miraculous power. Our most, and this coincides with a discussion earlier, our most detailed indication of Kant's views on God's metaphysical relation to us comes from some not entirely trustworthy notes, I think, to lectures on philosophical theology. The Wood notes that were translated some time ago have various problems. but I'll mention them anyway because you see these quotes are the same that Andrew had. These notes discuss problems in conceiving either a natural concursus of God with the world in general